Good day, everyone. I'm Mike LaCorte, the host for Leaders Podcast. Leaders Podcast is a podcast where I get the chance and the opportunity to speak to some of the most influential figures in the investigation and intelligence industry. Today, I am honoured to be joined by Mr. Ian Withers. Ian is a career private sector professional. He's been in the industry a long time. He's a good friend and colleague. He's worked all over the world. And I'm very excited to have this discussion today with Ian. So welcome, Ian. Could you just introduce yourself, please?
Good morning, Mike, and thank you for the opportunity. Well, I am Ian Withers, and I started my investigative career. I fell into it, believe it or not, in 1960, when I was a member of the Territorial Army and got assigned some intelligence gathering duties, and that piqued my imagination. And from there on, through a family business in the building industry, we ran into a problem with a client, and I was allocated to go and track him down, which I enjoyed far more than working in the family construction business. From there, I was lucky enough to find an opening as a trainee investigator for an agency in 1962 in Kingston Detective Agency. The good and bad with that was that the boss was an excellent trainer and gave me lots of opportunities, both at learning the business, being trained with very good class employees that were skilled and experienced, and also moved me into management. But that era, homes, marriages, children come along, and I decided to join the police. I joined Surrey Police and spent a wonderful couple of years patrolling on a motorcycle around Surrey. And then my boss, Quartermain, came and tracked me down and made me an offer I couldn't refuse in 1966, I think it was, when he'd bought out a very well-known PI of the era, Peter Hymes. And I took on the job of a 2-year contract to manage the business called Southern Provincial Investigations, which was owned by Peter Hymes, a long-standing member, of course, of the ABI. That was really the beginning of management in investigations. The company dealt with commercial work, that was tracing, repossessions, serving process, just literally hundreds of cases coming in every day. And that took a lot of patience, particularly as I was the youngest person on the entire company's 18-strong staff, and I was the manager, so it was very difficult trying to deal with people that had so many more years of experience, and certainly felt I should really be the T-boy rather than the manager. But that was the beginning of learning to manage people, to learn how to show respect and get respect back. And that was also the beginning of an introduction to high-profile cases, because the bad side to Barry Quartermain was he was a publicist. He loved to publicize his own stories, his own cases, and he did some pretty horrible things to gain newspaper notoriety. I was relatively young, just in my 20s, and tended to follow along and think that was great. Of course, the ABI existed, and it was a very closed shop. Barry Quartermain was denied membership. I decided not to apply, but on Peter Hymes' advice, he suggested I didn't even fill out the application because it would be there forever. And it was a very, very difficult time in terms of trying to find anywhere where you could formalize a training or education. So after a few years with Barry Quartermain, which introduced me to some big media cases involving research for BBC documentaries that were re-examining murder convictions, the most famous of which was probably the Hanratty case, the murder of Gregson on the A6, called the A6 murder. I spent months re-investigating that, taking statements, recording new witnesses that were traced. But despite going to appeal and then later on to the criminal convictions review, it never ever got anywhere, and the offender, of course, was executed. Other cases came along, including the Jeremy Thorpe case, which is covered in my book, when, unknown to the general public, a potential Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Jeremy Thorpe of the Liberal Party, was conducting a homosexual affair at a time when homosexuality was still illegal, and his boyfriend, as you might say, disappeared to Ireland and was blackmailing the MP and consequently the Liberal Party, looking for money. I had the job to go and try and find him in Ireland, which I did, although I never actually met him, other than, shall we say, a fleeting glimpse when he disappeared from my view. And as a result of that, he thought I was out there to get him, and he contacted the Liberal Party, and they came to an arrangement at an infamous meeting in Dublin. As all things, though, of course, Barry Quatermain and I eventually fell out, and my contract finished at the end of 2 years, and I did not renew it, and then took up a partnership business with my brother, which had its own high-profile media history. Again, really, these were cases that we took on that were in the public eye, attracted a lot of publicity. Publicity, good or bad, generated more business, and we lived for a few years under that rather misnamed advantage of there is no such thing as bad publicity. And unfortunately, that does tend to be the case, although these days I'm a bit much more cautious about it. But from there, I went on to start work for a number of governments, and it all started very simply tracking down the so-called £10 POMs that went to Australia and didn't stay for the required 2 years, jumped ship and got themselves back home, and then owed the Australian government money for their fares and their keep, and we got the job of tracking them down and trying to recoup the money or serve in process. That covered Canada, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa. South Africa developed more. I ended up managing to get a contract with the South African government's, at the time, a secret agency called BOS, Bureau of State Security, which of course I had to deny for years because it was still current. And I worked for them in London over a long period of time against what they perceived as terrorism, and developed a skill at infiltrating these little cells and getting information which enabled the South African government to prevent explosions, bombings and what have you in South Africa. That was the beginning.
I mean, I think we could probably have a whole series on your journey, the cases you tackled and the individuals that you've worked for and investigated, and you've written books about it. So that would would be very interesting for anyone who's listening and wants to follow up on Ian's books. The titles will be coming up on the screen, and the links to purchase those books are there as well. So please check those out. And I have read your book, Ian, and it's fascinating. Some of the stories and some of the situations you've put yourself in as a private sector professional investigator have been challenging and difficult, to say the least. So in terms of you then started to devote some of your time to associations. I see that you're a past regional director for NALI, which is the National Association of Legal Investigators, and you're a member of NCISS and also NAPS. Could talk to me a little bit about why, and also you're a founding member of WAPI, or the World Association of Professional Investigators, which is celebrating its 25th annual conference this year in November. Talk to me a little bit about, because it can be a lonely world investigating. You were quite lucky to join quite a big team of 18 investigators when you started your career. Those companies in the private sector are few and far between now. There are either the big four, and then there are the smaller 1, 2, 3 man operations. Talk to me a little bit about your decision to devote some time and join associations and that mindset. What made you do that?
Fundamentally, again, you have to go back to look at it from a historic perspective in order to get the direction of travel. And way back in the 60s, there was only the ABI. They had a little dispute, and from that was born the IPI, and they became the only two associations, both of which tended to be, shall we say, rather insular clubs. You were either in or out, and the vast majority either didn't bother to apply or were declined. So there came a time when there was a thing called the Younger Committee on Privacy, where lots of people, myself included, were invited to submit proposals in terms of how controls could be applied by law to private investigations, and in particular, the introduction of privacy. I gave evidence to the Younger Committee, along with many other colleagues as well, and I put up the proposal, and this is where I started to look at it from a political point of view, the politics of the investigation sector, as we tend to call it. And my view was that private investigators should be treated in the United Kingdom much the same as the certificated bailiff, who was certified by a local county court, given the certificate, and was then able to go and levy for debt and tax arrears. And he was subject to the approval of and the supervision of the local county court. So it would have been such an easy thing, rather than reinventing the wheel, which still hasn't been reinvented after 50 years, to have had the county court deal with it, issue a certificate. It was self-funding. You paid a fee for your certificate every year, and the condition could have been that you had insurance and that you complied with the standard rules, if you like, of the civil court. That never got anywhere. And then, of course, it develops along, and we got into the discussions for licensing. And I was, together with other colleagues, we had a so-called secret meeting in about 1998 to discuss what we could do if there was to be licensing. And the idea that we came up with a little help, I might add, from Peter Hymes, who still said, well, we wouldn't be welcome in the ABI, but why didn't we start our own association? And WAPI was the idea that was born out of it. My late brother Stuart came up with the idea, and a few of us all agreed, and we created WAPI, which took a year or two to put into a serious format and a serious project. And we announced it to the world in 2000. It came into real force after the Act, which was in 2001. In those early days, along with other colleagues from the ABI, your good friend and Secretariat Tony Amossi, and the IPI's representatives from the WAD and CIA were all involved in what we called the Way Forward group. And the group of us, we started to have meetings with the Home Office to discuss our perspective in terms of how licensing should be, what it should be all about. We are the ones that created the pattern, so to speak, of how the Home Office started to look, and the legislators started to look at how you define. We gave them all the definitions that we could think of to help them define how the law should be. So eventually the law was passed, and the Way Forward group then developed into what was called the implementation group, where again, along with the SIA now, which had been formed, we had regular meetings to assist them on how to evaluate how they wanted to regulate us. We had things such as the criminal record check, which everybody agreed was a necessary thing, but it should be relevant and it should be recent. So, for example, people that had convictions for serious offences such as theft, dishonesty, sexual offences, they should never be licensed because they would have had access to potential victims. Whereas lesser offences, shoplifters, bike stealers, minor thefts, motoring offences, if they were long enough ago, they would be deemed as spent convictions, as under the Rehabilitation Act, and that recency and relevancy would be taken into consideration in terms of licence applications. So then WAPI had to take a view. We had the ABI, who fundamentally were making the play, shall we say, to to lead the licensing of the sector, but there were an awful lot of us that were not members of the ABI and were unlikely to become members of the ABI. So in these early days, the important thing, politically speaking, was to get a mandate. So I ended up representing WAPI, which at that time had generated almost 200 and growing members, everyone in fear of licensing, suddenly wanting and seeing a need to have representation. And we had an open e-group. The open e-group attracted nearly 1,000 subscribers within its first few months. The main e-group of the day was the UK PIN, which itself had the best part of 700 or 800 members or subscribers. They joined us, so I ended up with a mandate when I sat down at these committee meetings of the membership of WAPI and the e-groups and the UK PIN groups. So we represented the unaligned, as we call it. We represented the unaligned, and we were the biggest group. There were only 500 or 600 people, members of the ABI, the IPI at the time, and we were representing thousands of people. And so we fitted very neatly into the niche with the Home Office and later with the SAA, because we were able to disseminate what they were saying to so many more people. But in the true spirit of cooperation, politics aside, WAPI, the ABI and the IPI, we held and organised a number of joint conferences. The best known one was at Elstree, where we had over 150 people from across Europe and overseas to an international meeting to discuss regulation in Europe and the UK. And that really was where I fitted in. I suddenly found myself representing my colleagues and being the mouthpiece at these various organisations.
Okay. And then you then used WAPI as the group, as like you said, the mouthpiece and the following in terms of subscribers to the e-group. But then why did you reach out to Nally? What was your journey there? What was the international link in terms of making you think, well, hold on, there may be something international that I should get involved in?
In 1979, as you probably know, I ended up landing a contract for the government of Seychelles. And I ended up in Seychelles, and I lived there from 85 until 92. When I came back at 92, the business that I had built up before going to Seychelles, I had sold. It was a franchise-based business. I grew the business by franchising. And I had sold the franchises to the various franchisees. So they all owned the business, all operating under my trade name. So I eventually bought back 2 of them. Some of them came back on a voluntary basis, and I rebuilt the business in the 1990s. And I was based at that time in the Republic of Ireland, in Dublin, which was a growing economy. So it's a very busy operation. And Dublin and Ireland, as always, had close connections with the US. Half the population, are Irish. Half the population of the United States are Irish or claim Irish descent. It's true. Having said that, we got some work in from some US attorneys and started to do the work. They were paying us in dollars. They were paying US prices, which were considerably more than we were earning in Ireland or indeed in the UK at the time. So the little cash register started to tinkle, and we thought, my goodness me, there's some business to be done there. There's a lot of international work coming out of the US. So I was very lucky. I had just moved from Dublin back to Northern Ireland, and the Northern Ireland government were offering grants for businesses that were going to generate foreign revenue. So we applied for a grant in 1999, and believe it or not, they gave a private investigation firm a substantial grant of 50% of the costs to send a team of us to New Orleans to an international conference, and it was organized by Nally. And Brilliant. So I went into that conference, and I looked for the first time at what I call a serious conference, a serious association, where you see real people, real PIs that speak the same language, but on the other side of the ocean. And we set up a little trade stand there called Priority Investigations, and it was the US to Europe gateway. And what we advertised was no time constraints, no language problems, no legal problems, no reporting problems, no payment problems. We'll accept payment in dollars to a US bank account. And literally within a month, we had work coming in to the point it was difficult to handle it. We had to slow it down. And from that moment on, 2019 to this very day, over 70% of our total revenue is derived from the United States. We stopped advertising in the UK. We stopped advertising in Ireland. We still get work coming in purely on referral. But our main target now is US business. And the work that we do for the US is work that US agencies and lawyers need to have done outside the USA.
How do you get your benefits out of the association? I know you see you've got, so how do you, if you're a new member and you're joining these associations, how do you do what you've done? Because it's not, that journey is not easy. So what advice would you give someone who's looking to expand their reach?
Advise this to anybody coming into the business, much as your previous speakers have said. The first thing to do is to join as many associations as you can. Don't consider it a cost, consider it an investment. And believe me, you'll get more work out of belonging to an association than you will get on paid advertising. And I know that from personal experience. Yellow Pages was a terrible expense time. Thank God that's all gone. Yes, join the association, and where you can participate when they're looking for somebody to do something, they want somebody to represent or to run a particular program, or to be able to talk about your work to other members so that we all learn from each other. And I have been very lucky for the last 25 years, despite my tender age. I still go twice a year to the States to NALI conferences, and I go for the social side, but more importantly, the lectures that take place there and the learning that you have from the most expert of people, both from law enforcement, from the military, and from police, director of police, and training, qualifications, professors. We've even had complete days at university campuses, kind of covering things that you would never dream about. And it may not even help you in your day-to-day work, but the knowledge that you have in your head when you do these things enables you to talk to anybody about anything to do with the investigation profession. And that is so valuable.
Yeah, completely. Staying up to date. And it's not just joining, it's turning up, it's going to the events, it's meeting as many.
You know, to belong to an association is a privilege, and it also makes you consider very carefully what you do and how you do it, because the last thing you want to do is to be embarrassed yourself, and even more so to embarrass the association that you may be a member of.
Completely agreed. What so someone coming into the industry now, Ian, because it's different to when you started back then 60 odd years ago, and I think the industry is just changing quickly now, and we're in this uncomfortable period, I think, in terms of private sector investigating in what happens next. What are the challenges for someone starting to become a private professional investigator as a first-time career?
I think the challenge is to try and find somewhere to work, to exercise that desire. It's very, very hard to find agencies, particularly in the UK and Ireland, where most investigation service providers tend to be one-man or very small businesses with no real openings. So training at an educational level is an essential. If you're able to take a course at university, or even paid for courses where you get a qualification that is recognised, at least when you go looking for a job, you've then got some evidence that you have some abilities and some instinct that may be helpful to a potential employer. Many people do just start up on their own, having done a course, and they derive their work by offering their services to other agencies on a subcontract basis. And fundamentally, that's how we tend to work in the UK, more so than most other places. Many of us in the PI business within the UK tend really to be investigation managers rather than on the ground investigators. we take a job in, we look after the selling part of the business, we contract it, we make sure that we deal with all the compliance issues and requirements, and we then look at it and say, how are we going to deal with this job? And then we subcontract elements of the job to different people based on their skills. If we have a big surveillance, why would we jump in a car and go out and do a surveillance ourselves when you've got ex-military trained surveillance teams available now? All you have to do is to sell the concept to the client that they're going to be better off and get a better service if they authorize you to use an a surveillance team, rather than getting the office boy or the office girl to jump in the car and go and follow somebody. Those days, gladly, I think I'll go in. We used to do those kind of things. It still happens, but you're far better off to use specialists. And one of the points of advice I tend to give colleagues when they ask is under no circumstances accept a contract where you're not competent to deal with what you're contracting to do. So if somebody asks you, for example, we need you to take fingerprints, and you're not a qualified fingerprint taker, then you don't say, I will do it. You will say, I will find someone qualified to do it. And it's really important to ensure that the competence that you sell is the competence that you have or can obtain.
Yeah, great advice there, Ian. What's the future for the investigation industry in the UK? How do you see it rolling out? Will we ever be licensed? What are the other influential factors? How do you see the industry going on the next generation?
I'm an absolute pro-regulation person, and one of the things that WOPI was created for was to deal with licensing, bringing it in and dealing with it. Licensing is essential. Essential for a number of reasons. The social reasons are to make sure that all people that practice are properly trained, properly controlled, and are compliant, and are not setting out to take front money from vulnerable clients and then disappear. And unfortunately, we still have those on a day-to-day basis. People can stick an advert up without any fear of being chased by the police or the authorities, take money and disappear. And that is just a very sad reality. That's only one reason. The second reason is that over time, the requirement for law enforcement outside of the police is going to grow. It's happening all the time. We have a policy within government internationally where they have decided, government have decided, generation after generation, to reduce the cost of policing. So the view is now to have us police ourselves. And the best example of that is anti-money laundering. So instead of having a police force that will investigate, shall we say, strange transactions in monetary terms, they impose an obligation on banks, solicitors, car dealerships, and any other business that deals with big sales, that they have to check their customers, query and report anything which is out of the norm. Mm-hmm. And if they fail to do it, they get humongous fines. So fundamentally, you've got the banks now become a policeman. Your solicitor is now a policeman. You have to identify yourself if you want to buy a house. Prove who you are to your own solicitor. So this area is going to grow, where eventually lots of work that the police currently do or don't do will be farmed out, because ultimately it's going to be cheaper to engage qualified private sector operatives, many of whom are police officers, to do this work. And what an amazing thing it is, no matter what problems we have in the country with fraud, which is a growth industry, still the government claim that they can't afford to engage more police officers, qualified police officers, to deal with it. And yet they won't come to the private sector, where half of us are ex-police and have had all the training at public expense, and yet they will not pass the work out. There have been exceptions. Unbelievably, way back in 1990, Thames Valley Police gave a contract to my brother's company, Nationwide Investigations, and in the course of that contract, they installed a PNC terminal in Nationwide Investigations offices in London, and the purpose was to trace parking offenders
Mm-hmm.
and road tax offenders. So under that contract, they would locate and issue summonses or serve summonses to those people. So those contracts are possible. They ran it for 2 years. It was there, but they decided it was too expensive, and it moved on. So there is still lots and lots of room, and I think the potential for the future is going to be that law enforcement will gradually spread out, and the investigation sector will be taking on more of that type of work, from summons service to tracing.
Fantastic, Ian. I get what you're saying, but the KYC element of it is part of the onboarding process that these companies have to do as part of their criteria, and that may fall under licensing categories or not. I don't know. It could be competency type tests. Like, I know that the ABI's had a code of conduct approved by the Information Commissioner's Office that demonstrates good GDPR knowledge and compliance. Would something like that, you think, grow within the industry as something to run along licensing, or to be completely separate from licensing? What are your views on that?
Interesting. Yes. You mentioned a little earlier on, I'm just going to cut across you there. You mentioned a little earlier on that I was a member of NSIS in the States.
Yeah.
One of NSIS' prime roles is to represent the sector at minimizing, reducing, or preventing additional legislation which limits what private sector investigators can do or how they can do it. So I would say that when you go into any voluntary code, what you're really doing is putting another obstacle in the way of day-to-day work. Having said that, I can see the value, once it's here, of everybody complying, so that we all work from the same, a level playing field. There's no point in having one association with a particular set of voluntary codes, and as a result, clients tend to prefer that, which is great if that happens. I think it has to be open to every association and their members to have the same qualification, fair playing field across the board.
But do you think something like that would create interest in the industry and create a requirement, or do you think something like that would not be what the real, in the absence of licensing, is it not what the sector
personally
needs?
I think, yes, I know it's a difficult question,
and it's a difficult question.
I don't want to be, if you like, arguing with what many of my peers believe is correct. I don't disagree that people should can have a qualification or have a voluntary standard. That's brilliant. Yes, absolutely. It's not vital, but it's a very good advice to have to, if you like, be accepted by other professions. Having said that, there is going to be no real alternative to licensing. Licensing has got to be the ultimate. And then once you've got licensing, it's the licensing authority, the government, that deal with the standards and the qualifications, rather than dealing with it ourselves, because politics are such that nobody 100% is going to agree with everything. Yeah.
And we're in an uncomfortable position at the moment. I can't believe we haven't got licensing here in the UK. We're one of the oldest industries, practicing countries of private investigation in the world. And it's, how do you control what's out there? I don't know. It'd be interesting moving forward as this world develops. I want to finish off on one final point, Ian, because it's been fascinating talking to you, and I think I could have spoken to you for a lot longer. What makes a strong leader? What qualities make a strong leader, in your opinion?
I think, one, you have to be willing to put your head above the parapet. You also have to be respected, and to be respected, you have to show respect. So if you value everyone's opinion, even those that you disagree with them politely, be able to negotiate, to express your views and to understand their views. These are all vital points. And the ability to persuade those that you're dealing with that you are serious about what you are presenting and that you have a mandate to do so. The mandate is the most important thing. So if you're a chairman of an association or a representative of an association and they are behind you. That is your mandate, and that alone takes you a long way. But for me, I think the most important thing is the respect begets respect syndrome.
Thank you, Ian. It's been a pleasure speaking to you today. Ian's details are coming up on the screen now. Please check out the book Ian's written. Those details are there. The link for payment is there as well. Ian, thanks again for your time on Leaders Podcast, and have a great day, everyone.